I watched them all from across the banquet hall. Champagne glasses glinting under crystal chandeliers, white linen tablecloths perfect as fresh snow. My son Thomas stood tall in his tailored suit, his arm wrapped around Veronica's waist, both of them laughing at something her father had said. The room buzzed with conversation and celebration, but I sat alone at my assigned table, table 14, far from the head table where my only child celebrated his engagement without me. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. It hadn't always been like this. There was a time when Thomas would race through the front door after school, backpack dragging behind him, eager to tell me about his day. I'd listen from the kitchen, chopping vegetables for dinner, nodding at his stories about classroom triumphs and playground politics. His mother had passed when he was only 5. Cancer took her quickly, cruelly, leaving just the two of us to figure out life together. And we had. At least I thought we had. Through Little League games where I cheered from the bleachers until my voice gave out. Through middle school science fairs where we stayed up late gluing planets to cardboard. Through high school graduation where I embarrassed him by crying too loudly when they called his name. Through college drop-off where we both pretended I wasn't devastated to drive home alone. But somewhere along the way, maybe when he started at his father-in-law's investment firm, maybe when he bought that German car I couldn't pronounce the name of, maybe when he moved into that downtown high-rise, something shifted. The phone calls became shorter, the visits home rarer, the tone when he spoke to me different. I adjusted my tie, uncomfortable in the formal attire I rarely wore. My watch, the one Thomas had given me for my 50th birthday before things changed, felt heavy on my wrist. The engraving on the back read, "To Dad, my hero." I wondered if he even remembered giving it to me. The microphone squealed as someone tapped it, and the room quieted. Thomas's future father-in-law, Richard Harrington, stood at the front of the room, his silver hair perfectly coiffed, his smile practiced and pristine. "Welcome, everyone. Tonight we celebrate not just an engagement, but a merger of sorts." Light laughter rippled through the crowd, between two exceptional young people. I watched as Richard continued, speaking about his daughter with genuine pride, then turning to Thomas. "And Thomas, what can I say about the young man who's joining our family? Smart, ambitious, the kind of son every father dreams of." My chest tightened. I reached for my water glass, took a sip to dislodge the sudden lump in my throat. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. After Richard finished, Thomas stepped up to the microphone, one arm still around Veronica. "Thank you all for coming tonight. I just want to say how grateful I am to the Harringtons for welcoming me into their family." He looked at Richard and his wife. "You've both been like the parents I never had." The room fell silent. A few uncomfortable glances shot my way. I sat very still, hands folded on the table, face carefully blank. Around me, people shifted in their seats, suddenly interested in the centerpieces. Thomas seemed to realize his mistake. His eyes found me in the crowd, but instead of apologizing, he gave a small shrug and continued. "Well, you know what I mean. Anyway, Veronica and I are so excited for this next chapter." I barely heard the rest. The words, "parents I never had," echoed in my ears, drowning out everything else. 27 years of bedtime stories, of bandaged knees, of college tuition payments, of standing in the rain at soccer games, erased in a single sentence. After the speeches, dinner was served. I picked at my salmon, making small talk with the distant relatives seated at my table. They meant well, these people who barely knew me, asking about my work, contractor, specializing in historical renovations, my hobbies, woodworking, though I didn't mention that Thomas's childhood bedroom was still filled with the shelves and toy chests I'd made him. I excused myself as dessert was being served, needing a moment alone. The hotel's balcony overlooked the city skyline, lights twinkling like earthbound stars. The night air was cool against my face, a relief after the stuffiness of the banquet hall. "Dad?" I turned to find Thomas standing in the doorway, silhouetted against the bright lights inside. For a moment, in that backlit frame, he looked like the boy I remembered, uncertain, seeking approval. "Congratulations," I said, my voice steady. "Veronica seems wonderful." He stepped onto the balcony. "Thanks. She is." He fidgeted with his cufflinks. Silver, monogrammed, probably a gift from Richard. Look, about what I said in there. It's fine. I cut him off. I understand. Do you? He laughed, but there was no humor in it. Because I don't think you do. Do you have any idea what it's like introducing you to people like the Harringtons, explaining that my father fixes old houses for a living? That he still lives in the same 3-bedroom ranch we've had since I was born? I stared at him. This stranger wearing my son's face. Is that what this is about? Money? It's about more than that. His voice rose slightly. It's about ambition. Drive. The Harringtons built something. What have you built? A few bookshelves? Fixed a few leaky roofs? Each word landed like a physical blow. I looked down at my hands. Calloused, scarred from decades of honest work. I built a home for us, Thomas. I built a life. A small life, he said, the words dripping with disdain. A worthless life. The moment stretched between us, vast and unbridgeable. Inside, the party continued. Laughter, music, the clinking of glasses. Out here, something was breaking, something I hadn't known could break further. I should get back, Thomas finally said. Veronica will be wondering where I am. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. He hesitated, like he might say something more, then turned and walked back inside, the door closing behind him with a soft click. I stayed on the balcony for a long time, watching the city lights blur through unshed tears. When I finally returned to the banquet hall, the party was winding down. I said my goodbyes to the hosts, congratulated Veronica with a kiss on the cheek, and left without speaking to Thomas again. The drive home was long and quiet. The house, our house, felt emptier than usual when I walked in. Photos of Thomas lined the hallway, baby pictures, graduation portraits, candid shots of camping trips and Christmas mornings. I walked past them without looking. In my workshop at the back of the house, I sat heavily in my old chair, surrounded by the tools and projects that had sustained me through the years. The half-finished rocking chair in the corner was meant to be a wedding gift. I wondered now if Thomas would even want it. That night, I couldn't sleep. Thomas's words played on repeat in my mind. A worthless life. Had I failed him somehow? Had my choices, staying in this house, continuing my work, living simply but honestly, somehow damaged him? Morning came with no answers. I made coffee, stronger than usual, and sat at the kitchen table with my notebook. In it, I'd kept track of our household expenses for decades, a habit from the lean years after Sarah died, when making ends meet sometimes felt impossible. I flipped through the pages, seeing the record of our life together. Thomas's first bicycle, braces, summer camps, college application fees, graduation gifts. The phone rang, startling me. Not many people called the landline anymore. I answered, half expecting a telemarketer. Robert Caldwell? A woman's voice, professional, unfamiliar. Yes? This is Sharon Adams from First National Bank. I'm calling about the co-signed loan for Thomas Caldwell. I frowned, confused. I'm sorry, there must be a mistake. I haven't co-signed any loans for my son. The silence on the other end stretched uncomfortably. Sir, we have documents with your signature authorizing a loan of $75,000 for Thomas Caldwell, dated 3 months ago. The room seemed to tilt slightly. That's not possible. I never signed anything like that. Sir, I'm looking at the paperwork right now. The signature matches the one we have on file for you. The funds were dispersed directly to your son's account. After the call ended, I sat motionless at the kitchen table. The implications were clear, but my mind refused to accept them. Thomas had forged my signature. Thomas had taken out a loan in my name. Thomas had stolen from me. With shaking hands, I called the bank where I kept my retirement savings. The balance was significantly lower than it should have been. I requested recent transactions and was told about withdrawals I had never made, transfers to accounts I didn't recognize. By afternoon, I had spoken with 3 banks, 2 credit card companies, and one very patient police officer. The picture that emerged was devastating. Over the past year, Thomas had systematically drained my accounts, opened credit lines in my name, and forged my signature on multiple documents. In total, he had stolen nearly $180,000, almost my entire life savings. The officer was sympathetic but direct. "You have two options, Mr. Caldwell. You can press charges for identity theft and fraud, which would likely result in criminal prosecution. Or you can handle this as a family matter." Family matter. The words felt hollow. What family did I have left? I thanked the officer and hung up. Outside my window, the neighborhood kids were playing street hockey, their shouts and laughter drifting through the glass. I remembered Thomas at that age, fearless on his rollerblades, determined to keep up with the older boys. How had we come to this? The doorbell rang just after 6. I opened it to find Thomas standing on the porch, his perfect suit replaced by jeans and a sweater, his hair slightly disheveled. "Dad," he said. His voice strained. "We need to talk." I stepped aside to let him in, saying nothing. In the living room, he paced while I sat in my old armchair, watching him. "The bank called you," he finally said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." My voice was flat, emotionless. "And the credit card company, and the investment firm, and the police." He flinched at the last word. "Dad, I can explain." "Please do." I gestured to the couch. "Explain to me why my son stole my life savings. Explain why the money I set aside for retirement, for medical emergencies, for whatever might come, is now gone. Explain why you committed multiple felonies against your own father." He sat, hands clasped between his knees, looking at the floor. "It wasn't supposed to be like this. I was going to pay it back before you ever found out." "With what money, Thomas?" He looked up then, his eyes red-rimmed. "There was an investment opportunity. Guaranteed returns. Richard introduced me to some people who needed capital quickly. If I could get in on the ground floor, I could double the investment in 6 months." I almost laughed. "And let me guess, it didn't work out that way." "The timing was off. The market shifted. But it's still going to pay off, Dad? I just need a little more time." "Time?" I shook my head. "Time won't help, Thomas. The money is gone, isn't it?" His silence was answer enough. "Did Veronica know?" I asked. "No." He ran a hand through his hair. "No one knew. That's why I needed the money so badly. Her family, they have expectations. The engagement ring, the apartment, the lifestyle. I couldn't keep up. And then, when the investment fell through, I needed more to cover what I'd already lost. So you stole it. From me. The person with the worthless life." He winced. "Dad, about what I said at the engagement party." "I've spoken with a lawyer," I interrupted. "He says I have a clear case for criminal charges. Identity theft, fraud, financial elder abuse. Minimum sentence is 5 years. All the color drained from Thomas's face. "You wouldn't." "Wouldn't I?" I leaned forward. "You stole my retirement, Thomas. You forged my signature. You lied to my face while systematically destroying my financial security. Tell me why I shouldn't report you." "Because I'm your son," he shouted, standing up. "Because it would destroy my life. My career, my relationship with Veronica, everything." "And what about my life?" I stood too, anger finally breaking through the shock. "The life you called worthless? The one you apparently valued so little that you were willing to steal everything I worked for?" He had no answer for that. "Get out," I said quietly. "I need time to think." "Dad, please." "Out." My voice echoed in the small living room. Now, after he left, I poured myself 2 fingers of whiskey, the good bottle I saved for special occasions, and carried it out to the back porch. The night was clear, stars visible despite the city lights. I thought about the day Thomas was born, How I'd stood at the hospital window holding him, making silent promises about the kind of father I would be. Had I failed so completely? Or had Thomas simply become someone I didn't recognize, shaped by forces beyond my control, ambition, greed, the desperate need to belong in a world that valued wealth above character? The next morning I called my lawyer again and gave him instructions. Then I made another call, to a realtor I'd worked with on several renovation projects. By the end of the week, I had a plan. It took a month to set everything in motion. I sold the house where Thomas had grown up, the workshop where I'd built his first bed. I liquidated what investments remained, closed my accounts, and quietly disappeared from the life I had known. The lawyer handled the final details, including one last message to my son. I won't press charges, but I won't be here when you come looking either. I bought a small cabin in the mountains, 3 hours north of the city. It needed work. Rotting porch boards, a leaky roof, windows that whistled in the wind, but that was fine. Work was what I knew, what I had always done well. The nearest town was 20 minutes away, population barely 500. No one asked questions about the quiet man who paid cash for his groceries and spent his days restoring an old cabin. 6 months passed. Autumn came to the mountains, painting the forests in brilliant reds and golds. I settled into a routine. Coffee at dawn, work until dusk, simple meals, early nights. Sometimes I missed my old life, the neighborhood where everyone knew my name, the clients who trusted me with their historic homes, but mostly I found peace in the solitude, in the honest labor of rebuilding something broken. Then one afternoon, as the first snow of the season began to fall, a car I didn't recognize came up my long driveway. I was on the porch, securing the last of the new railings I'd installed, when Thomas stepped out of the vehicle. He looked different, thinner, with shadows under his eyes that hadn't been there before. His expensive watch was gone, replaced by something practical and plain. He stood awkwardly by his car, snow gathering on his shoulders, waiting for an invitation that didn't come. "How did you find me?" I finally asked, setting down my hammer. It wasn't easy. His voice carried in the clear mountain air. "Your lawyer wouldn't tell me anything. I had to hire a private investigator." I nodded, unsurprised. Thomas had always been persistent when he wanted something. "Why are you here?" He took a tentative step forward. "The wedding's off. Veronica's family. When they found out about the money, about what I did." He trailed off, then started again. "I lost my job at the firm. I'm working construction now, actually, framing houses." Despite everything, I felt a small twist of sympathy. Thomas had never worked with his hands before, had always been dismissive of physical labor. "It's honest work," I said. "Yes." He looked down at his palms, now calloused like mine had always been. "That's what I've been learning. About honesty, about what really matters." I said nothing, waiting. The snow fell silently around us. "I've been paying back the loan," he continued. "Every month, whatever I can. It's not much yet, but I will pay back everything I took from you, even if it takes the rest of my life." "The money wasn't what hurt, Thomas." He nodded, his eyes finally meeting mine. "I know. What I said to you, how I treated you. There's no excuse. I got caught up in trying to be someone I'm not, in impressing people who didn't actually care about me." He paused. "I forgot who I was, who you raised me to be." The wind picked up, sending a swirl of snowflakes between us. I should have felt satisfaction seeing him humbled like this, but all I felt was tired. Tired of the anger, the disappointment, the broken trust. "I don't expect you to forgive me," Thomas said. "I wouldn't, in your place. But I needed to tell you that I'm sorry, not just for the money, but for everything. For not seeing the value in the life you built. For being ashamed of the man who gave up everything for me." He turned to go, shoulders hunched against the cold. "Thomas." I called. He stopped, looking back. "There's more work here than I can handle alone. Roof needs fixing before winter really hits." Thomas looked uncertain, his eyes searching my face for sincerity. Snow gathered on his eyelashes, giving him a vulnerable look I hadn't seen since he was a child. For a moment we both stood frozen, the weight of unspoken words hanging between us like the heavy mountain air. "Are you sure?" he finally asked, his voice barely audible above the whisper of falling snow. I nodded once, then turned and walked back toward the cabin. There's an extra room. Not much, but the bed's decent. Tools are in the shed. I didn't look back to see if he followed. The crunch of his footsteps in the fresh snow told me enough. Inside, I built up the fire while Thomas brought in his small duffel bag. Just one, I noticed, for a man who used to travel with matching designer luggage. Bathrooms down the hall, I said, keeping my voice neutral. Kitchen's basic but functional. I eat at 6. Thank you, Thomas said, standing awkwardly in the center of the living room, taking in the simple furnishings, the hand-built bookshelf, the worn but comfortable armchair, the coffee table I'd salvaged and restored. His eyes lingered on a small wooden box on the mantel, the one that held his mother's wedding ring and the letters she'd written for him before she died, letters he'd never bothered to read. That first evening was quiet, conversation limited to practical matters, where to find extra blankets, which roof sections needed the most urgent attention, how early we'd need to start in the morning. We ate a simple dinner of venison stew that had been simmering all day, sopping up the gravy with homemade bread. Thomas ate like a man who'd forgotten what real food tasted like. "This is good," he said, surprise evident in his voice. "Your mother's recipe," I replied. "She always said good food matters most when times are hard." He looked down at his bowl, a shadow crossing his face. "I don't remember much about her cooking." "You were young." I pushed my empty bowl away, "but she taught me everything I know about feeding a growing boy." After dinner, Thomas offered to wash up. I let him, watching from the doorway as he rolled up his sleeves and plunged his hands into the soapy water. His movements were clumsy at first, unsure, but he found a rhythm eventually. It occurred to me that he might never have washed dishes by hand before. When he finished, I was sitting by the fire with a book. He hovered nearby, as if waiting for instructions. "There's books on the shelf if you want to read," I said. "Or you can turn in early. Tomorrow will be physical." He nodded, selected a book at random and settled in the chair opposite mine. We read in silence, until the logs burned down to embers, and the wind picked up outside, howling around the eaves like a living thing. "We should get some sleep," I said, marking my page. "Storm's coming in faster than expected." Thomas set his book aside. Unread, I noticed, the bookmark hadn't moved, and stood. "Dad," he began, then stopped, swallowing hard. "I just want to say thank you for letting me stay. I know I don't deserve it." I looked at him for a long moment. "We'll see what you deserve," I said finally. "Good night, Thomas." The next morning dawned clear and cold, the world outside transformed by 6 inches of fresh snow that glittered in the early light. I was already on my second cup of coffee when Thomas emerged from his room, dressed in jeans and a flannel shirt that had seen better days. "There's coffee," I said. "Oatmeal on the stove. We've got about 30 minutes before we need to be on the roof." He nodded, helping himself to breakfast. I watched him from the corner of my eye, noting how he winced slightly as he moved his shoulders. Construction work had begun to build his frame differently, but he wasn't yet hardened to it. "You'll need these," I said, tossing him a pair of work gloves. "And there's liniment in the bathroom cabinet for your shoulders. No point starting the day already sore." Surprise flickered across his face. "How did you know?" "I've worked with my hands for 40 years. I know what new muscles look like when they're complaining." Up on the roof, the work was straightforward but demanding. Several sections of shingles had rotted through, creating weak spots that would turn into leaks once the heavy winter snows began to melt. We worked systematically, stripping away damaged sections, replacing water-stained plywood, laying new shingles. Thomas was tentative at first, watching me carefully before attempting each task, but by midday he was moving with more confidence, finding a rhythm with the hammer, learning to read the grain of the wood. "You're not bad at this," I commented as we broke for lunch. Sandwiches and thermoses of hot soup, eaten sitting on the ridge of the roof overlooking the valley below. "I had a good teacher," Thomas replied quietly. "When I was a kid, you used to let me help with projects around the house. Remember that tree house we built when I was 9? I nodded. "You were fearless with heights even then. Nearly gave me a heart attack climbing out on those branches." A small smile touched his lips. "Mom took pictures." Said she'd never seen anyone look so terrified and proud at the same time as you did watching me. The mention of Sarah hung in the air between us. For years after her death, I'd tried to keep her memory alive for Thomas, telling stories, marking birthdays, preserving traditions. But, as he grew older, he'd become uncomfortable with these remembrances, as if grief were a childish thing he'd outgrown. She'd be disappointed in me now, Thomas said suddenly, looking out over the mountains. In what I became. I considered this. Your mother never had much patience for foolishness, I agreed. But she believed in second chances, said everyone deserves at least one do-over in life. We worked until dusk, finishing one section of the roof completely. By the time we climbed down the ladder, we were both exhausted, hands stiff with cold despite the gloves, backs aching from hours of bending and lifting. Inside, I built up the fire while Thomas took a hot shower to ease his muscles. When he returned to the living room, I handed him a mug of tea, laced with honey and whiskey. Best thing for keeping the cold out, I said. He accepted it gratefully, wrapping his hands around the warmth. Dad, he said after taking a sip, can I ask you something? I nodded, settling into my chair. Why did you let me come here? After everything I did, everything I said, why didn't you just tell me to go to hell? I considered the question, watching the fire dance in the hearth. When your mother was dying, I said finally, she made me promise something, not just to take care of you, that was a given, but to remember that love isn't something you earn. It's something you give, even when it's hard. Thomas looked down at his hands. I don't think I understood that until recently. Most people don't, I said, until they've lost something that matters. Days turned into weeks. The roof was finished just before the first major snowstorm hit, burying the cabin in drifts that reached the windowsills. We moved on to other projects, reinforcing the foundation, insulating the north wall, rebuilding the woodshed. Thomas proved to be a quick learner, his hands growing calloused and sure. In the evenings, we established a routine: dinner, cleanup, then hours by the fire. Sometimes talking, sometimes silent. Sometimes I'd carve while Thomas read aloud from whatever book had captured his interest. The space between us, once vast and unbridgeable, began to narrow. One night, as a particularly fierce storm raged outside, Thomas asked about the years after his mother died. Was it hard, raising me alone? I set down the piece of pine I'd been shaping into a small owl. Yes, I said simply. There were days I wasn't sure I could do it. Days I was certain I was making all the wrong choices. But you never showed it. I always thought you were, I don't know, invincible or something. I smiled slightly. That was the point. You needed stability, not my doubts. Thomas was quiet for a long time, watching the fire. I've been thinking about what you said that day, at the house. About building a life. I didn't understand then. And now? Now I think maybe I was the one living the small life. Chasing things that didn't matter. Trying to impress people who didn't care about me. He met my eyes. The firm I worked for. They dropped me the minute the Harringtons pulled their business. Richard wouldn't even take my calls, but the guys on the construction crew, they gave me a chance when no one else would. I nodded, understanding. Real value isn't always where you expect to find it. Winter deepened around us. Christmas approached, though neither of us mentioned it directly. I noticed Thomas spending more time in the workshop I'd set up in a corner of the garage, working on something he kept covered with an old sheet. On Christmas Eve, after a simple dinner, Thomas disappeared into his room and returned with a small, carefully wrapped package. It's not much, he said, placing it on the table between us, but I wanted to give you something. I unwrapped it slowly. Inside was a wooden box, similar to the one that held his mother's things, but with an intricate pattern carved into the lid. Mountains like the ones visible from our window, with a small cabin nestled among trees. Thomas, I said, running my fingers over the careful workmanship. This is beautiful. He looked pleased but embarrassed. It's my first real project. The guys at the site showed me some techniques, but I've been practicing at night. Open it. Inside the box was an envelope. I opened it to find a bank statement showing a small deposit, $500, and a handwritten note. First payment. Many more to come. It's not much, Thomas said again, but it's a start. I nodded, unexpectedly moved. It's a good start. The next morning, I presented Thomas with his gift, a set of woodworking tools I'd carefully restored, each handle polished to a warm glow. Quote, "These were my father's," I explained. "And his father's before that." Thought it was time they were passed along. Thomas accepted them with reverent hands, understanding the significance. "I'll use them well," he promised. We spent the day building shelves for the pantry, working side by side in companionable silence. That evening, as snow fell softly outside, Thomas asked the question that had been hovering between us. "Can I ever make it right? What I did to you?" I set down my coffee mug. "That depends on what right means to you." "I want to pay back everything I took," he said. "But it's more than that. I want to—" He struggled for the words. "I want to be worthy of being your son again." "You've always been my son, Thomas. Even when I couldn't stand the sight of you, that never changed." He swallowed hard. The things I said at the engagement party hurt. I finished for him. They hurt because there was a part of me that feared they might be true, that maybe I had failed you by not giving you the kind of life the Harringtons could provide. "No," Thomas shook his head emphatically. "You never failed me. I failed you. I got caught up in a world where nothing was ever enough. Not the car, not the apartment, not the watch or the suit or the vacation. There was always something more, something better that everyone else seemed to have. And now?" I asked. "Now I understand what real value is." He gestured around the cabin. "It's building something with your own hands. It's knowing your work matters. It's—" He paused, searching for words again. "It's sitting by a fire with someone who loves you enough to tell you the truth." Winter slowly released its grip on the mountains. As the snow began to melt, revealing patches of earth beneath, Thomas and I started work on a new project. An addition to the cabin, a small workshop where we could work side by side during the coming year. One evening in early spring, as we sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains gold, Thomas broached a subject we hadn't discussed in months. "I got a letter from Veronica," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "She's engaged again. To someone her father approved of from the start." I glanced at him, gauging his reaction. "How do you feel about that?" He considered the question. "Relieved, honestly. What we had, it wasn't real. Or maybe it was real, but it wasn't right. I was trying so hard to be someone I thought she wanted that I lost track of who I actually was." I nodded, understanding more than he knew. In the years after Sarah died, I'd had my own moments of reinvention, trying to be both mother and father, provider and nurturer, strength and softness all at once. "Sometimes," I said, "the hardest person to be honest with is yourself." Thomas looked at me, really looked at me, perhaps for the first time in years. "How did you do it, Dad? After Mom died? How did you keep going?" It was a question he'd never asked before, not in all the years since Sarah's passing. I took a deep breath, feeling the cool evening air fill my lungs. "One day at a time," I said simply. "Some days, 1 hour at a time." I focused on what was in front of me. You, the house, my work, the things I could touch with my hands and make better. We sat in silence as the last light faded from the sky, stars beginning to appear in the darkening blue. "I'm going back to school," Thomas said suddenly. "Night classes at the community college in town. Engineering. I want to understand how things are built from the ground up." Pride, unexpected, powerful, swelled in my chest. "That's good, Thomas. That's really good." "I've been thinking," he continued, "about staying here, not just for now, but longer, building something of my own nearby. If that's okay with you." I considered the proposal. The solitude of the mountains had healed something in me, had given me space to rebuild not just this cabin but myself. Was I ready to share that space permanently? Looking at my son, still young, still finding his way, but now walking a truer path. I knew the answer. "Land's cheaper on the North Ridge," I said. "Good southern exposure. Protected from the worst of the winter winds. We could start clearing a site this summer." Thomas smiled. A real smile. Unguarded and grateful. "I'd like that." As darkness settled around us, I thought about the journey that had brought us here. From the bright banquet hall where Thomas had called my life worthless, to this quiet porch where we were building something new together. Not just structures of wood and nails, but something less tangible and more enduring. Trust, respect, understanding. Your mother would be proud, I said softly, not of who you were, but of who you're becoming. Thomas nodded, his eyes bright in the gathering darkness. I think, he said carefully, she'd be proud of both of us. And in that moment, on that porch, under a sky brilliant with stars, I believed he might be right. Summer arrived in the mountains with an explosion of wildflowers and birdsong. The days grew longer, the air warmer, and our work moved outdoors. Thomas and I spent weeks clearing the plot on the North Ridge, felling trees, removing stumps, leveling ground for what would become his own cabin. It was backbreaking work, but there was satisfaction in watching the clearing expand day by day, in seeing possibility emerge from wilderness. One morning in late June, we took a break from our labors. Sitting on newly felled logs with canteens of water, surveying what we'd accomplished. I want to do this right, Thomas said, wiping sweat from his brow. Build something that will last generations. I nodded, understanding the deeper meaning behind his words. We'll start with a proper foundation. That's the part no one sees, but it's what holds everything else together. Thomas's design for his cabin was modest but thoughtful. 2 bedrooms, an open living area, and a workshop nearly as large as the living space itself. He'd sketched it carefully, making revisions as his engineering classes taught him new principles of structure and support. I've been thinking about that loan, he said, taking another sip of water. The one I forged your signature for. I tensed slightly but kept my expression neutral. We hadn't discussed the money much since Christmas, though Thomas continued making small monthly deposits into my account. I met with the bank manager in town yesterday, he continued. Explained the situation. He says I can transfer the debt entirely into my name. Can you handle the payments on a construction worker's salary? I asked. Thomas nodded. It'll be tight, but I've worked out a budget. No more fancy clothes, no more restaurants, no more. He gestured vaguely. Appearances to maintain. I studied him. My son, still young at 28, but with new lines around his eyes, new strength in his shoulders. You've changed, I observed. Had to, he replied simply. The old me wasn't someone I wanted to be anymore. We resumed work, the rhythm of our tools filling the mountain silence, axes biting into wood, shovels scraping against stone, the low growl of the chainsaw for the larger trunks. By mid-afternoon, we'd cleared enough space to begin marking the perimeter of the foundation. Dad, Thomas called, holding one end of a measuring tape. Come look at this. I walked over, wiping dirt from my hands. What is it? I think we've got a problem. He pointed to a massive boulder, partially buried in the soil, right where the southeast corner of the cabin would stand. That's not going anywhere without dynamite. I knelt beside the stone, brushing away layers of earth to gauge its size. Sometimes, I said, the obstacle becomes part of the design. Thomas frowned. What do you mean? I mean we adjust. Build the foundation around it. Incorporate it into the structure. Maybe it becomes part of a hearth or a feature wall. But the plans change, I said, standing. Life's full of unmovable objects. The trick is learning to build with them, not against them. Thomas considered this, then nodded slowly. Like you did. After Mom died. I looked at him, surprised by the insight. Yes, exactly like that. That evening, back at my cabin, Thomas spread his design drawings across the kitchen table, reworking the floor plan to accommodate the boulder. I watched him erase and redraw, his face intent with concentration. You know, I said, stirring the pot of stew on the stove, your mother would have loved this. Thomas looked up, pencil poised. The cabin? That too, but I meant seeing you create something. She always said you had an artist's eye, even when you were little. He smiled, a hint of sadness in it. I don't remember her saying that. She said a lot of things you might not remember. I hesitated, then added, those letters in the wooden box. She wrote them for moments she knew she'd miss. Your graduation. Your first serious relationship. The day you found your purpose. Thomas set down his pencil, his expression suddenly vulnerable. I've never read them. I was afraid to. Maybe it's time, Quote. After dinner, Thomas retrieved the box from the mantel, his hands trembling slightly as he opened it. Inside, alongside his mother's wedding ring, were a dozen envelopes, each labeled in Sarah's neat handwriting, for Thomas's high school graduation, for Thomas's wedding day, for when Thomas becomes a father, and one simply marked, for when Thomas feels lost. He stared at them for a long moment, then carefully selected the last one. I think this is the one I need right now. I nodded, standing to give him privacy. I'll be out on the porch. The night was clear, stars scattered across the black sky like diamond dust. From my rocking chair, I could see the outline of the mountain ridge where Thomas's cabin would stand. The air smelled of pine and distant rain, though the forecast promised clear weather for days to come. After nearly an hour, the screen door creaked open and Thomas joined me, his eyes red-rimmed but calm. She knew, he said, settling into the chair beside mine. Somehow, she knew I'd lose my way eventually. I smiled sadly. Your mother always saw people clearly, their strengths and their blind spots. She wrote that failure isn't falling down, it's refusing to get back up. Thomas's voice caught slightly. She said that you'd always be there to help me stand again, even when I pushed you away. The words hung in the night air, a truth that Sarah had seen long before either of us. She was smarter than both of us, I said finally. Thomas laughed softly. She also wrote that you're stubborn as an old mule and would rather eat nails than admit when you're hurting. It was my turn to laugh. Well, she wasn't wrong about that. We sat in companionable silence, rocking gently, the wooden chairs creaking in unison. Above us, a shooting star traced a brief, brilliant path across the sky. Make a wish, I said automatically, the way I had when Thomas was a boy. He shook his head. I don't need wishes anymore. I know what matters now. The foundation for Thomas's cabin took shape over the next month. We dug trenches, laid forms, mixed and poured concrete. The boulder we'd discovered became the anchor for a massive stone hearth that would serve as both structural support and the heart of the living space. Thomas's engineering classes proved useful as we calculated load-bearing requirements and proper drainage. My decades of practical experience filled in the gaps that textbooks couldn't cover. How to read the land, how to work with the natural slope, how to build in a way that would harmonize with the surrounding forest rather than fight against it. One evening, as we finished setting the last of the foundation posts, a truck I didn't recognize came up the drive. Thomas straightened, wiping concrete dust from his hands, his expression a mix of surprise and wariness. That's Eddie, he said. My foreman from the construction crew. Eddie turned out to be a barrel-chested man with a salt and pepper beard and calloused hands that spoke of decades in the trade. He greeted Thomas with a hearty clap on the back. So this is where you've been hiding out, he said, surveying our work with an appraising eye. Not bad for a rookie and... He turned to me, extending his hand. You must be the father I've heard so much about. We talked shop as the light faded, Eddie offering suggestions about timber framing techniques suitable for the mountain climate. Before he left, he handed Thomas an envelope. What's this? Thomas asked. Bonus from the Westfield project. You earned it. And Eddie hesitated. There's a foreman position opening up in the fall. Boss asked me to sound you out about it. After Eddie departed, Thomas and I walked back to the cabin in silence, the envelope heavy in his pocket. Inside, as I started dinner, Thomas sat at the table, turning the envelope over in his hands. A foreman position, he said finally. I never expected that. Why not? I asked, slicing vegetables for the stew. He shrugged. I've only been with them a year. There are guys who've been there a decade. And what did Eddie say about them? He said... Thomas paused, recalling the conversation. He said they know how to follow instructions, but I know how to solve problems. Said that's rarer than experience. I nodded, unsurprised. You always did have a knack for seeing around corners. Thomas opened the envelope, his eyebrows rising at the amount on the check inside. Without hesitation, he took a pen from the counter and endorsed it. "For the restitution fund," he said, sliding it toward me. "Every bit helps." I looked at the check, then at my son. "Keep it," I said. "Put it toward your cabin. Consider it an investment in your future." "Dad, I need to pay you back." "Everything I took." "You will," I interrupted. "But not at the expense of moving forward. Sometimes the best repayment is becoming the person you're meant to be." Late July brought a heat wave, the kind that made the air shimmer above the meadows, and drove us to work in the cool hours of early morning and late evening. The frame of Thomas's cabin rose steadily, post and beam construction with mortise and tenon joints, a method centuries old but still superior for structures meant to withstand mountain winters. One particularly sweltering afternoon, we abandoned work entirely and hiked to a hidden swimming hole I'd discovered the previous summer. The water was ice-cold, fed by mountain springs, clear enough to see the smooth stones lining the bottom. Thomas dove in without hesitation, surfacing with a whoop that echoed off the surrounding cliffs. "Come on, Dad! It's amazing!" I joined him more cautiously, the shock of cold stealing my breath momentarily. We swam in companionable silence, then rested on sun-warmed rocks like lizards, letting the heat penetrate tired muscles. "I called Richard Harrington yesterday," Thomas said suddenly. I turned my head to look at him, surprised. "Why?" "To apologize." Thomas kept his eyes on the sky above, not for his approval or forgiveness, just because it was the right thing to do. "How did that go?" Thomas smiled wryly. "About as well as you'd expect. He said I'd embarrassed his family, betrayed his trust, and he hoped never to hear from me again." "And how do you feel about that?" He considered the question. "Lighter. Like I've set down something heavy I didn't need to carry anymore." I nodded, understanding. Sometimes closure isn't about reconciliation, but about taking responsibility, then walking away clean. "There's something else," Thomas said. "I've been offered a teaching position at the community college. Just one-night class on basic construction principles. Nothing fancy, but you should take it," I said immediately. He looked surprised. "You think so?" "I know so. You've always been good at explaining things, breaking them down to their essence." I sat up, brushing pine needles from my back. "Besides, teaching others what you know, that's how you truly master it yourself." The roof of Thomas's cabin went up in early August, a community effort that brought Eddie and several other members of the construction crew up the mountain for a weekend. They arrived with trucks loaded with timber and tools, plus enough food and beer to sustain an army. I watched from the sidelines as Thomas directed the operation, confident without being overbearing, quick to listen to suggestions, but firm when he knew his way was better. The men respected him, that much was clear, not because of his title or his education, but because he worked alongside them, pulling his weight and more. By Sunday evening the roof was complete, and we celebrated with an impromptu feast around a bonfire. Eddie raised a toast as the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. "To Thomas," he said, beer bottle held high, "who proved that it's never too late to find your true north." The men cheered, Thomas ducking his head in embarrassment, but clearly pleased. Later, as the party wound down and the crew prepared to head back to town, Eddie pulled me aside. "Your son's something special," he said, voice gruff with sincerity, when he first showed up at the job site. Designer clothes, soft hands, looking like he'd never seen a hammer up close. I gave him a week, tops, but he surprised us all. Eddie looked over to where Thomas was helping load the last of the equipment. "Whatever happened between you two, it's good to see it mended." After the crew departed, Thomas and I stood in the clearing, admiring the cabin's silhouette against the darkening sky. "It's really happening," he said softly. "My own place. Built with my own hands." "With a little help," I reminded him, smiling. "A lot of help," he corrected. "I couldn't have done any of this without you, Dad." The words hung in the evening air, simple but profound. It struck me that this was what I'd wanted all along. Not gratitude or repayment, but acknowledgement. Recognition that the life I'd built, the values I'd upheld, mattered. "That's what fathers do," I said finally. "They build foundations." As autumn approached, Thomas's cabin neared completion. We installed windows, hung doors, laid flooring. Each element was chosen with care, not for luxury or show, but for durability, functionality, and a simple kind of beauty that came from honest materials well used. The boulder that had initially seemed an obstacle became the focal point of the main room, its natural contours incorporated into a massive stone fireplace that dominated the north wall. We faced it with local fieldstone, each piece selected and placed by hand in a pattern that appeared random but was carefully balanced in color and texture. "It's perfect," Thomas said as we stood back to admire the completed hearth. "Better than what I originally planned." "That's often how it goes," I replied. "The things that challenge us end up defining us." On a crisp September morning, with leaves beginning to turn gold and crimson on the surrounding hillsides, Thomas built the first fire in his new home. We sat on the floor. Furniture would come later, watching flames dance against stone, feeling the warmth radiate through the room. "I've been thinking," Thomas said, eyes fixed on the fire, "about what you said that day at the engagement party. About building a life." I waited, giving him space to continue. "I think I understand now," he went on. "It's not about what you accumulate or achieve. It's about what you create that matters to others. What you leave behind that makes their lives better." I nodded, throat suddenly tight with emotion. "That's as good a definition as any. You built a good life, Dad. A worthy one." Thomas turned to face me, his expression earnest. "What I said that night. Calling your life worthless. It's the thing I'm most ashamed of. Not the money, not the lies. That moment when I tried to diminish everything you are." "We all say things we regret," I said quietly, "but not all of us get the chance to make them right." Thomas reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, polished wooden object. A carving of two hands, one older and weathered, one younger and strong, clasped together. He placed it in my palm. "I can never repay everything I took from you, not just the money, but the respect, the trust. But I want you to know that I see you now. I see the life you built, the man you are. And I'm proud to be your son." The carving was exquisite in its simplicity, smooth to the touch, the grain of the wood flowing through both hands as if they were formed from the same tree. I closed my fingers around it, words momentarily beyond me. Outside, a woodpecker drummed against a distant tree, the sound echoing across the clearing. Through the windows, sunlight poured in, warming the new wood floors, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like tiny stars. "There's something else," Thomas said, hesitation in his voice. "I've been offered a full-time position teaching construction at the technical college in town. It would mean less time on actual job sites but more stability." "What do you want to do?" I asked. "I want to do both if I can. Keep my hands in the practical work, but also pass on what I know." He smiled slightly, like someone taught me. Pride swelled in my chest, not the hollow pride of status or acquisition, but the deep satisfaction of seeing values take root and grow. "You'll find the balance," I said. "You always do, eventually." As winter approached once more, Thomas moved permanently into his cabin. We celebrated with a small gathering, Eddie and some of the crew, a few of Thomas's students from the college, neighbors from the valley below who'd become friends over the past year. It was a simple affair, food cooked over the fireplace, music from an old guitar someone brought, conversation that flowed as easily as the homebrewed beer. Thomas moved through the gathering with quiet confidence, at home in this life he'd built with his own hands. Late in the evening, as guests began to depart, Thomas found me on the porch, watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. "Thank you," he said simply. I knew he meant for more than just helping with the cabin. For the second chance. For the lessons taught through action rather than words. For the kind of love that holds firm even when tested by fire. "You're welcome," I replied, equally simple. We stood in comfortable silence, father and son, two cabins on a mountainside, two lives intertwined yet independent. Below us, the valley stretched into darkness, lights from distant homes twinkling like earthbound stars. Above, the real stars blazed in patterns as old as time itself. "Dad," Thomas said after a while, "do you remember what you said that night at the engagement party, after I called your life worthless?" I nodded. I said, "How does it feel to know this loser will stop paying your bills?" Thomas laughed softly. It felt like the end of the world. Now it feels like the beginning. And in that moment, under that vast sky, I knew we had both found our way home. 2 years passed, the seasons turning like pages in a well-worn book. The mountains witnessed our quiet evolution. Thomas establishing himself at the technical college, me easing into a semi-retirement that left room for select restoration projects I found meaningful. Our cabins stood as testament to what we'd rebuilt between us, sturdy shelters against both winter storms and life's unpredictable gusts. On a crisp October morning, I was enjoying coffee on my porch when Thomas's truck came up the drive earlier than usual. He stepped out with purpose in his stride, a thick envelope clutched in one hand. "Morning," I called. "You're up with the birds today." He smiled, taking the porch steps 2 at a time. "Big day, Dad. Got something important to show you." I made room at the small table, curious. Thomas had matured into a man of quiet confidence. His face weathered from outdoor work, his hands strong and skilled. Gone was the polished veneer he'd once hidden behind. In its place, an authenticity that suited him far better. "What's this?" I asked as he set the envelope between us. "Open it." Inside, I found bank statements, each marked with transfers and deposits spanning the past 2 years. The final page showed a balance that made my breath catch. Exactly $180,000, the amount Thomas had stolen from me. "It's done," he said simply. "Every cent." I stared at the papers, momentarily speechless. We'd never discussed a timeline for repayment. I'd assumed it would take decades, especially after Thomas chose teaching over higher-paying construction management roles. "How?" I finally managed. "Been living lean," he said with a shrug. "Plus, remember that blueprint I was working on last winter? The one for sustainable mountain homes? A development company bought the design, said it was exactly what they'd been looking for." Pride surged through me. "Thomas, that's remarkable. There's more." He pulled another document from the envelope. A deed transfer for 5 acres of pristine forest adjacent to our properties. "This came up for sale last month. I bought it in your name." The land in question was spectacular. A gentle slope with southern exposure, a year-round spring, and old-growth forest that filtered sunlight into dappled patterns on the forest floor. I'd admired it often during our hikes, but never considered owning it. "You didn't need to do this," I said quietly. "I wanted to." Thomas's eyes met mine, steady and clear. "It's not just about paying back the money, Dad. It's about showing you that I understand what matters now. That land, it's not an investment to flip or develop. It's something worth preserving, something to pass down someday." I ran my fingers over the deed, feeling the embossed seal beneath my thumb. "Thank you," I said, the words inadequate for the moment. We sat in companionable silence, watching a red-tailed hawk circle lazily above the tree line. There was no need to fill the space between us with unnecessary words, a comfort we'd both grown into over the past years. "There's something else I wanted to talk to you about," Thomas said after a while. "I've been seeing someone." This was news. Since the broken engagement, Thomas had shown little interest in dating, focusing instead on his teaching, his building projects, and our weekly hikes exploring the mountain ranges. "Tell me about her," I said, refilling our coffee cups. "Her name's Ellie. She teaches environmental science at the college. We met when she brought her class to see the sustainable building techniques we're using on the new campus center." A smile played at the corners of his mouth. "She's nothing like Veronica." "In what way?" "She's—" Thomas searched for the right words. "Real, grounded, more interested in what you know than what you own. She's got this little cabin down in Miller's Valley that she built herself. Off-grid solar panels, rainwater collection system. Not fancy, but ingenious. I nodded, hearing what he wasn't saying, that he'd found someone whose values aligned with the man he'd become, not the man he'd pretended to be. "When do I get to meet her?" I asked. "That's why I'm here. Thought maybe you'd come to dinner at my place tonight." "Nothing formal, just the three of us." That evening, as the sun began its descent behind the western peaks, I walked the familiar trail between our cabins. Thomas had strung lights along his porch rails, their warm glow welcoming against the gathering twilight. Through the windows, I could see movement. Thomas in the kitchen, another figure beside him. I knocked lightly before entering, and Thomas greeted me with an uncharacteristic hug. "Dad, come meet Ellie." She was not what I expected. Tall, with auburn hair cropped short, dressed in jeans, and a flannel shirt rolled to the elbows. Her handshake was firm, her smile genuine. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, "Thomas has told me so much about you, especially your restoration work. I've actually seen some of it. The Jenkins farmhouse in town? Beautiful craftsmanship." Dinner was simple but delicious. Fresh trout Thomas had caught that morning, vegetables from Ellie's garden, bread she'd baked herself. The conversation flowed easily, moving from building techniques to local conservation efforts to favorite hiking trails. As Ellie described her work with the college's sustainability program, I noticed something in Thomas's expression I hadn't seen before, a quiet admiration untainted by insecurity or comparison. He seemed content in his own skin, proud of his accomplishments without needing to inflate them. After dinner, as we sat by the fire with mugs of tea, Ellie asked about our journey, how we'd ended up building adjacent cabins in these remote mountains. Thomas and I exchanged glances, a silent question passing between us. "It's a long story," Thomas began carefully. "One that doesn't paint me in the best light." "I'd still like to hear it," she said, "if you're willing to share." So we told her, not all at once, but in pieces, each of us filling in different parts of the narrative. Thomas spoke with unflinching honesty about his mistakes, the money he'd stolen, the cruel words at the engagement party. I spoke about my anger, my disappearance, my eventual decision to offer a second chance. Ellie listened without judgment, asking occasional questions but mostly absorbing our shared history. When the story reached the present, she was quiet for a moment, considering. "Thank you," she said finally, "for trusting me with that." Later, as I prepared to head back to my cabin, Ellie excused herself to make a phone call, giving Thomas and me a moment alone. "She's remarkable," I said. Thomas nodded. "She is. And you know what's strange? 5 years ago, I probably wouldn't have given her a second look. Too ordinary, not impressive enough for the image I was trying to project." He shook his head. "What a fool I was." "Not a fool," I corrected. "Just lost for a while. We all get lost sometimes." The following spring brought new beginnings. Thomas and Ellie were married in a simple ceremony on the ridge between our cabins, with the newly leafed forest as their cathedral and mountains as witnesses. The guest list was small, colleagues from the college, friends from town, Eddie and the construction crew who'd become like family. No expensive suits, no elaborate flowers, no champagne in crystal flutes. Instead, Thomas wore a shirt he'd made himself in an introduction to textile arts class he'd taken over the winter. Ellie carried wildflowers gathered that morning. Their vows, written together, spoke of partnership, stewardship, and authentic living. I stood beside my son as his best man, the wooden box containing Sarah's wedding ring in my pocket. Before the ceremony, I'd given it to him privately. "Your mother would have loved Ellie," I'd said, pressing the box into his palm. "She would have loved the man you've become even more." After the simple reception, a potluck feast where everyone contributed something meaningful, Thomas and Ellie departed for a hiking honeymoon in the national park 200 miles north. The guests helped clean up, then drifted away as evening approached, leaving me alone on the ridge where the ceremony had taken place. I sat on a fallen log, watching twilight gather in the valley below. The air was sweet with pine and new growth, birds calling their evening songs from the forest. In that moment of solitude, I felt Sarah's presence more strongly than I had in years. "You were right," I said aloud to the gathering darkness. He found his way back. Summer flowed into autumn, And with it came unexpected news. One evening in late September, Thomas and Ellie appeared at my door, their faces glowing with barely contained excitement. "We have something to tell you," Ellie said, her hand finding Thomas's. The announcement shouldn't have surprised me, but it did, in the best possible way. They were expecting a child, due in early spring. As they shared their plans, converting the second bedroom into a nursery, building a playground beneath the old oak tree, starting a college fund that would never be touched without permission, I saw in Thomas a reflection of myself at his age. The same mixture of terror and joy, the same determination to be the father his child deserved. That winter, as snow blanketed our mountain in hushed white, Thomas began a new project, a cradle carved from a single piece of maple, its curves flowing like water, its surface polished to a satin gleam. He worked on it in my workshop, claiming his cabin was too filled with half-completed baby furniture to add another project. "You will make mistakes," I said finally. "Different ones than I made. Different ones than you're worried about now. That's the nature of parenting." "That's not exactly reassuring," he said with a half-smile. "It's not meant to be. It's meant to be honest." I sat on the workbench beside him. "The question isn't whether you'll make mistakes. It's whether you'll have the courage to recognize them and change course when needed." He nodded slowly, running his hand over the smooth curve of the cradle. "Like you did with me." "Like we both did," I corrected. "It takes two to build a bridge." In March, as the first crocuses pushed through melting snow, Thomas's daughter entered the world. They named her Sarah Catherine, for her grandmother and for Ellie's mother. I was in the waiting room when Thomas emerged from the delivery suite, his face transformed by a joy so profound it nearly brought me to my knees. "Dad," he said, voice thick with emotion, "would you like to meet your granddaughter?" She was tiny, perfect, swaddled in a hospital blanket with only her face visible. A face that somehow held echoes of both Thomas as a baby and my Sarah in the curve of her cheek and the shape of her eyes. When Ellie placed her in my arms, the weight of her, so light yet so significant, unlocked something in my chest that had been sealed away for decades. As spring deepened into summer, little Sarah became the center of our shared world. Thomas took a sabbatical from teaching to be home with her, while Ellie returned to work part-time. The cradle he'd carved with such care became her favorite napping spot. Placed in dappled shade on the porch, where mountain breezes gently rocked her to sleep, I found myself crossing the path between our cabins more frequently, ostensibly bringing over meals or offering to watch the baby, while Thomas tackled household projects, but in truth, simply drawn to the miracle of new life, to the chance to witness what I'd thought forever lost. A family growing, thriving, building something meaningful together. One evening, as we sat on Thomas's porch watching fireflies rise from the meadow, Sarah sleeping peacefully in my arms, Thomas broke our comfortable silence. "I've been thinking a lot about worth lately," he said, "about what makes a life valuable." I glanced at him, waiting for him to continue. "When I said those things to you at the engagement party, about your life being worthless, I was measuring by all the wrong metrics. Money, status, influence." He shook his head. "Now I understand what real wealth is." "And what's that?" I asked, though I suspected I knew the answer. He gestured toward his sleeping daughter, then out at the mountains surrounding us, then finally toward me. "This. Connection. Purpose. Building something that outlasts you." He paused. "Loving in a way that makes others stronger." The truth of his words settled around us like the gathering twilight. I thought of the journey that had brought us here. From that painful moment in a glittering banquet hall to this quiet porch where 3 generations sat together under a canopy of stars. The path had been neither straight nor easy, marked by betrayal, loss, hard labor, and harder conversations. But it had led us home. "You know," I said, shifting little Sarah slightly as she stirred in her sleep, "your mother used to say something similar, that we're not measured by what we acquire, but by what we build and who we become in the building." Thomas smiled. "She was a wise woman." "She was," I agreed. "And she would be so proud of the architect you've become, not just of buildings, but of your own life." As darkness fell completely, We sat in companionable silence, the only sounds, the gentle breathing of the sleeping baby, and the distant call of an owl from the forest. Thomas had built more than a cabin on this mountain. He had constructed a life of integrity, purpose, and genuine connection. And in helping him find his way back from the brink, I had discovered new dimensions to my own journey, the strength to forgive, the courage to rebuild, the wisdom to value what truly matters. The insult that had once cut so deeply, how does it feel to be worthless, had lost its power, transformed through time and growth into a question with a very different answer. How does it feel to know your worth? To recognize the value in quiet work, in honest relationships, in a life well lived. It feels like this moment, on a mountain porch with my son and granddaughter, surrounded by the world we built together, one day, one choice, one act of forgiveness at a time. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.